Following a practical, repeatable, teachable system for developing leaders is an important step to delegating decision-making and problem-solving. This is part 2 of a 5-part series on how to develop up-and-coming leaders. Stay tuned and I'll share a good second step that has proven to work well for me to develop leaders to make solid decisions I can trust.
Running a service business can be hard. It is not unusual for business owners in industries like contracting, home repair, auto repair, business-to-business services like janitorial, IT and accounting, and many others to feel overwhelmed by all the priorities facing them at any given time. Between addressing the needs of the customers, managing the employees, figuring out the financials, and getting processes in place, feeling like you're making significant progress on your business journey can be difficult. Welcome to Service Industry Success, hosted by Brian Harding. Each week, Brian will look at real-world strategies for building the business you are dreaming of, while also sharing tactics to get through some of the most frustrating parts of business ownership with a lot more ease. Let's get started.
For many business owners and leaders, a problem they desperately want to solve is developing effective leaders in their organization. To delegate decision-making, problem-solving, and so they can get out of the weeds and have some people help them, and do things that help them with oversight and training and teaching and, give them a chance to put their eyeballs on other things that have a higher ROI or just take a break or catch up on projects they've been not being able to get to. Develop better marketing strategies or outreach strategies. So while this is both important and urgent, it's also common to not have real certainty about where to start and what is a path to teaching people leadership. So that's a problem I want to address in this episode and this series. It's a 5-part series, and this is episode number 2 of that 5-part series. And if you hadn't listened to the first one, go back to episode 190? Yeah, 190, and you can listen to where I was just being a first step. And I think this would be a good second step. Now, one of the things to know, of course, is there's more books written on leadership than probably anything out there, except for maybe sales and religion. There's tons and tons of books on leadership, and they all have different strategies, and I think they're all fantastic. There's lots of good leadership stuff out there. This is not about teaching so much like different tactics and things like that. This series is more about teaching consistency and having process of how we address things. And those books are fantastic for getting in the weeds on things. And I think there's so much great information out there in those books. I highly recommend reading those books and having your team of leaders read those books. That's not what really this is, though. This is more about teaching a known way of addressing things in our organization and then taking the information from those books and applying it where it makes most sense. So for most of us, we put people in leadership roles who have demonstrated an ability to take responsibility or consistently solve problems, or they've done a great job of developing rapport with customers and coworkers. They have industry knowledge, and they just generally have a desire to excel and advance their career. So we put them in these roles, but then we don't really know where to go from there. So we often end up navigating through a lot of painful trial and error, which not only is it painful, it's expensive and can take a great deal of time because we're basically having 2 people do the job of this leader because they do a thing and they bring it to you and well, here's what I did. And you're like, no. Next time you should do this. Or we have to jump in and override that or, mitigate a problem they may have caused inadvertently or whatever. So this whole series is about just creating a structure and a framework for leadership that we can all be kind of consistent in how we do things. So again, if you didn't listen to the last episode, I'd highly recommend you go back and start there and then come back to this one afterwards. But something I want to establish early on in the case of this series is step 2. It doesn't have to be step 2, but I want to do this very, very early, is the understanding that we as leaders, in my opinion, must address behaviors and responsibilities. Now, when I say responsibility, I mean this specifically. I don't know what the Webster definition of responsibility is. That's not what I'm after here. My definition of responsibility in this context is initiative, ownership, and accountability. So whenever I say responsibility, that's what I mean. I mean initiative, ownership, and accountability. So I want to establish early on with my leadership team the understanding that we must address behaviors and responsibilities first, And then we move on to addressing task, action, and process problem. Now, why is that? Well, because in my opinion, when we have a responsibility or behavior problem, when we take care of that, it resolves a whole bucket of problems, not just one. It resolves problems like this, not just this problem. So you can probably, think back to the last 2 weeks where you've had an issue with an employee where they did a thing, they made a phone call, they left a voicemail, but the problem wasn't really resolved. The customer's still unhappy. The customer doesn't feel that their needs were taken care of. Or an employee had a problem and the supervisor's like, well, I called and left a voicemail and it's not on me if they didn't get back to me. So that is a good illustration of the difference between a process, an action, or a task, i.e., the phone call and the voicemail, versus a behavior and responsibility. Responsibility being initiative, ownership, and accountability. I want resolution, which requires them taking responsibility. In my made up illustrations here, they're saying, well, I did the task. I made the phone call. I left the voicemail. And we're not talking the same things. We're talking very much apples and oranges here. They're talking task. I'm talking responsibility. So if I can resolve the responsibility issues, if I can get this person to understand the proper amount of initiative, ownership, and accountability they should have, the process problems are likely to be resolved within that. If they take a reasonable amount of responsibility, they will seek out the task, action, and process solutions without needing to be prompted. And they'll own those solutions, and they'll hold themselves accountable and be willing to be held accountable for the outcomes of those solutions they put in place. The inverse is not true. If I get them to adhere to a process, make a second phone call when the voicemail didn't work and the customer still has a problem, maybe call them again in 3 hours or the next day or whatever. I can get them to adhere to that process, but that does not mean they will take the initiative, ownership, and accountability or display the proper behaviors to go proactively deal with this next time. I've solved a singular problem with a singular conversation. I have not changed their behavior. I have not changed their understanding of what their proper responsibility is. So I've solved one problem with one conversation. If I address the behaviors and responsibilities, I address many problems with one conversation. So this is something that is not intuitive in my opinion. It took me many years to learn this. Again, lucky for me, I had some fantastic mentors who held me accountable to follow a similar structure and didn't allow me to have these one-off conversations very often because they were letting me know, this isn't super productive. How many conversations would you have to address the dozens or hundreds of situations just like this if you're going to take them on one at a time? So the other thing is, so we covered the responsibility part, initiative, ownership, and accountability. On the behavior part, if people are behaving in a way that aligns with our values, principles, and priorities, even if they make a mistake, they will learn and adapt their actions accordingly. They'll change their process next time. Again, the inverse is not true. Without the correct behavior, process problems will more likely than not have to be caught and intervened with by another person, like a manager or supervisor. So if they're not behaving in a way that's in line with our values, principles, and priorities, somebody else has got to be the double check. Somebody else has got to step in and catch problems or, oversee or maintain compliance or measure performance on things that we shouldn't really have to measure. So teaching somebody to address behaviors is way more productive than again, just like the responsibility, it's way more productive to address the behaviors first than it is the process and the task and the action first. So one of the things that will happen here is the word attitude may come up. And this is where I learned the word behavior from one of my mentors, Bill. He did not allow his supervisors and managers to use the word attitude in a negative way about an employee. And after working with and for Bill for many years, I adopted the same thing in my company. I can have a bad attitude and the employee can have a good attitude. The employee cannot have a bad attitude though. If there's an attitude problem, I need to address their behavior, not their attitude, for a couple reasons. One, there's no short of the employee walking up and saying, "Yep, I have a bad attitude." It's a no-win conversation. We can never know definitively what's in their head, and they're not likely to say, yeah, I had a bad attitude. So it's going to end at a best case scenario, a stalemate most of the time in which there's no resolution. But perhaps more importantly, if a manager comes into my office and says, that Johnny's got a bad attitude today, well, the manager's basically letting themselves off the hook for resolving anything. It's Johnny's problem. It's not the manager's problem. Johnny needs to get his stuff squared away. Or if I say, well, wait a second, what's the behavior? Well, he rolled his eyes and stomped out of the room, and I said a thing he didn't like. Okay, well, go be a manager and deal with it. That's your responsibility. And so this is where the behavior thing sometimes gets sidetracked as we start talking about attitude, and the word behavior goes out the window. In every case, not just some or most. I mean this, in every case, not just some or most. I want my manager to explain their plan to address the behaviors and responsibilities we need from the employee before they go on telling me about how they're going to resolve the process or action part of the situation. This compounds the ROI of any conversation because we're tackling many similar problems with each conversation rather than just one particular issue. Again, if I can get the responsibility part fixed, that applies to many situations just like this one we're having the problem with. If I skip that part and only address the action, task, or process part, and going back to my phone call example, I'm handling a phone call, not situations like phone calls without resolution. It also forces the manager to become more tuned into to diagnosing and addressing responsible behavior problems at least as well as they can, deal with process and task problems. And in my opinion, behavior problems are much more time consuming and responsibility problems are much more time consuming to deal with and have a much bigger negative impact on the company's overall performance than any task or action thing. I mean, think about this. How many times have you had an employee that was fantastic at fixing the widget in your industry? They were fantastic. Their technical knowledge was fantastic, but they were such a pain in the butt to work with. They just had to go. Well, that's behavior and responsibility. Their behavior did not align with our core values, our principles, and our priorities. Or they wouldn't take responsibility for stuff. They were constantly pointing fingers at other people, whatever it was. It was Sally's problem, not mine. Oh, this time it was John's problem, not mine. This time it was Fred's problem, not mine. In those situations, they're not a good fit because their responsibilities and behaviors don't align with what we need, not generally because they don't know how to turn the estimate on time, or they don't know how to follow our process or procedure for whatever it is that, they know how to do this stuff. They don't take responsibility and display the behavior that we need to be successful. And this is where up and coming managers, especially, they just have no experience with this in many cases. They've just been taught you just walk up as the boss, you just walk up and tell people what to do, and they're just supposed to like hop to. And it doesn't work that way in 2024. It might again in a couple of years, and it certainly did back in 1935. But at this moment in time in 2024, we have to deal with the behaviors and responsibilities first, and then deal with the processes, tasks, and actions. So I would say develop a system, even just a verbal one, of walking the manager through addressing each problem, starting with the underlying behavior responsibility first. And I would not allow the manager, my conversation with the manager to advance to the point where we're going to start addressing the process part of the resolution until we have a plan to deal with the behavior and responsibility part first. Now, no question, the first handful of times you do that, it's very time consuming. It's very time consuming to get them to think about, well, what is the underlying behavior driving this? What is the level of responsibility we need and where we at, currently relative to what we need? It does take time in the beginning. The first handful of times, this is a pretty slow process, but it gets faster and easier very rapidly. And pretty soon, oftentimes within a few weeks, maybe a couple months, at some point, you won't even have to ask. They will come into your conversation. They'll come into your office prepared for this because you've been asking every single time, and they will have done all the legwork and homework to figure this stuff out before they even get to your office if they know you're going to ask for it every time. And again, for me, this is a much more efficient way because of the compounding ROI of dealing with many problems in one conversation versus singular problems in one conversation. So anyhow, that would be a step 2. It doesn't have to be step 2. It's not the step 2. It's just a step 2. It's one that I like and one that I've used and one that I've been successful with. So that's a step 2 for developing a up-and-coming leader. So don't forget, if you find the information I share helpful, please share this podcast with a friend or colleague you think could benefit from it. And of course, public sharing is also appreciated. And that's it for this week, and I'll talk to you all next week.